now I'd like to invite people who are dealing with not only Pinot Noir, but also other varietals. So Ned, Jen, and Christina, if you wouldn't mind to join us, that would be very nice. And now the goal is to maybe start a discussion while I'm asking a few questions to our three panelists, and then hopefully we can break the session with question and answer with all of you.
My name is Jen Higgins. I'm the winemaker at Lambert Bridge Winery, which is up in Dry Creek Valley outside of Healdsburg. And we are a small winery. We do about 7,000 cases, but we make about 15 different wines because we sell to our membership, and that's how we sell all of our wines. So that means that we are getting fruit from all over Sonoma County, from Rockpile all the way down to Moon Mountain District, and working with a variety of growers. We have about 45 acres that we own and I help manage. And so it was a tough year. So that's all I have to say for now. But
I'm Christina Scheidler. I'm the winemaker for Arrowwood Winery. We primarily do Cabernet Sauvignon, so about 90% Cabernet Sauvignon from 3 different AVAs, Sonoma Valley, Knights Valley, and Alexander Valley, and also bring in a couple other varieties, Viognier, Sauvignon Blanc, Chardonnay, even some Rhone stuff. So very small exposure to some other varieties.
Okay, well, my name is Ned Horton. I'm vineyard manager at Guevara Vineyards, also in Dry Creek Valley. I oversee production on 3 estate vineyards totaling just over 90 acres, all certified CCOF organic. We farm with biodynamic practices, and our vineyards are planted with an emphasis on Sauvignon Blanc, Zinfandel, and Rhone varietals.
Okay. So I have maybe...
oh, now you need it back.
Just to make sure we get the conversation started, but hopefully it can become less formal. Regarding the early season stages, are there any consideration you had in order to manage differently your canopy, your water, and maybe your nutrients during the year compared to other years? Do you want to elaborate on that?
Sure. Well, I think one of the things that's important for us is in a year where there's, with the season definitely kicked off with high vigor, is making sure that to keep the fruit healthy and keep the canopies healthy, that we have good spray contact. So we were pretty aggressive early on about suckering, and I think in the end that might have been one of the things that helped us because we were early on getting good sun penetration into the green tissues. One of the things, we've been talking a lot about heat spikes here, and one of the things that we didn't see a lot of was real damage to green tissues. So that was the beginning, and then obviously we got our cover crops down pretty quickly, and as the season progressed, we kind of shifted gears as the weather changed.
Okay. Christina or Jen, do you want to add anything?
Should I share this?
Sure. You can share.
I was actually quite pleased with our canopy management at the beginning of the season. Yes, we had vigorous canopies, but by prioritizing blocks, we also do some organic farming. So by prioritizing those blocks, getting laterals removed earlier, getting some good sun exposure into the canopy, I was really happy about how things were looking. The more vigorous vineyards, we did delay suckering a bit to kind of let them exhaust all their energy and go back in maybe a couple times to modify those canopies. One thing that I thought was unique to this year, early season, was I saw a lot of shoulders on Cabernet, which usually is not the case in at least my vineyards. So we did quite a bit of shoulder removal, but going in up until June, July, I was actually pretty happy with how we had managed our canopies early season.
And then I would say also for us, we have a few ranches, particularly up on Moon Mountain, that canopy management is everything. And so what we've done, where we usually would pull laterals everywhere, we've kind of modified that because we wanted to shelter the fruit a little bit more from intense sun. So that happened. Wings also, but we always remove our wings. But yeah, it was a year that you really had to play to the vineyard, I think.
Okay, so the other question I wanted to ask you is, considering the complexity of Sonoma, the way different appellations within Sonoma are contrasted, because of the slopes, because of the exposure to marine entries. Do you see in the context of warmer temperature more or less contrast between sub-regions in Napa? In other words, is it more complex for you to manage the fact that Carneros or Sonoma Coast are maybe proportionally less affected by heat than the Kings Valley, Alexander Valley? Is this putting the extremes more apart or more tight together?
I'll start. I love this. We found that I think the contrast is a lot more widespread in Sonoma County for sure. We found a lot more variability between our ranches. We had a lot more cluster collapse happening on our cooler ranches in Russian River and also in the Fountain Grove area, Reevely Road area, than we did up in the warmer climates. So that was kind of interesting, and I don't know if that was because we also were leaving the canopy on a little bit later, pull some of the moisture out of the ground, and maybe it was opened up a little too late, and maybe that it wasn't acclimated enough. But I think it's very, very diverse.
What about you? You manage so many different regions.
Well, actually, no. That's the thing. We're really pretty narrowly focused on Dry Creek Valley. Okay. So the variability that we see within blocks and subblocks, and they tend to be based on soil type and rootstock combinations. And I would say that the polarities are becoming more extreme within blocks.
More extreme within blocks.
Well, within from one, like I'm saying, within those different combinations.
Okay.
Thinners, for example, 101-14 on a thin soil versus 110R on a valley floor.
Sure.
This past vintage, in the latter scenario, we had some good outcomes. In the former, not so much.
Okay. I don't know if you want to say.
Yeah, I would say that I saw quite a bit of variability between AVAs, but also within the vineyard, especially early season vineyards that were in the past more homogeneous, finding areas that were more vigorous, less vigorous. If I had to compare the three AVAs that I work with in context to Cabernet, I would say that perhaps the influence of Carneros and kind of that cool air Carneros into the Sonoma Valley, my vineyards fared better in Sonoma Valley than somewhere like Alexander Valley, where I did see those desiccated clusters and a little bit more shrivel up there. Knights Valley was probably the most sheltered, but with that, that fruit had to hang around a little bit more and put us into mid to late October, which also wasn't a good thing this year.
So it seems when I hear you that in the future we need to gear our effort towards more site-specific management practices, where in the past it was easier maybe to put everything in the same bag, so to speak. And that's a trend we see worldwide. Like more and more people are doing block-specific weather management. The timing is also getting more and more block-specific. So in that context, it seems important to standardize the way we analyze the season. I wanted to ask you what other alternative methods outside the ones I have suggested, 5 different periods, one leading to the next. What other ways of slicing the season seem relevant to you, or what comments could you bring to criticize or improve that way of analyzing the season? I'm thinking plant calendar based on the moon, biodynamic calendars, days calendars, growing degree days model. Like, how do you see those different models contradicting each other or actually leading to the adoption of one more standard timetable? So whomever wants to answer.
Well, yeah, I'll take it. I'll start with that one. I think all those models are really important to get a deeper understanding of vine physiology in the different stages. For us, I think the one, the kind of dominant factor is veraison and making sure that we're prepared for veraison. That looking for high wine quality, we want to make sure that the canopies are set up and the crop is balanced going into that. So again, I think the 5 stages you described are really important because there's effects of 2 that will impact 3 and so on. So, but we kind of start from there and then move out, I suppose. Obviously we don't want to get aggressive about leafing around bloom. So I tend to think more around, how are the different physiological stages evolving each vintage. What is the crop coefficient? How much horsepower do the vines have? And that's going to impact not only how we manage the canopies, but then also cover crops and cultivation, and then irrigation. So I think our perspective references all those, but tends to be very, very vine specific and block specific.
Okay. Christina or Jen, do you want to elaborate? What I'm thinking, for instance, I know some winemakers are actually setting up their projected harvest date based on number of days post-bloom, for instance. In the context of temperature changes, is this going to be still relevant? Like, I'm trying to have you respond to those other time scales.
In the past, I've paid attention to the growing degree days, but I find that it's becoming less and less relevant,
yes.
Especially in years like this where you think you're on track for something and there's this complete stalling period.
Yeah.
It was very irrelevant this year.
Yeah, that's what we saw too. I mean, it's nice to have that idea, but not anymore. I mean, it just doesn't, you can't follow it anymore. And that stalling of the sugars and the acids and the flavors was so evident this year for us because we picked most of our fruit after the heat spell and before the fires. It's kind of in that zone there. So yeah, we had to just be patient. It wasn't a year that you could rush into anything. You had to be watching.
So what would you do in order to track the footprint of the season?
I thought you were going to tell us what to do.
I mean, I suggested this framework with 5 stages, but maybe there is a better one or more nuanced.
I mean, for me, it's really spending the time out there. It's more intuitive. You're walking, you're tasting, and you're looking for that something that you need to have.
Cool. Yeah. So I had another question. In terms of winemaking, well, Jen, if you, how did you adjust your extraction techniques in 17 compared to historical vintages? Like, is there something you'd like to elaborate upon? I mean, it's building upon what Byron has mentioned earlier.
I remember tasting the samples, tasting the fruit, talking with the other people on our production team and saying this is the year that we really have to watch tannins. This is the quality of tannin wasn't there, and we saw it not really soften, improve. The fruit character was really red, like Rob was saying, this year for Cabernet varieties. So we luckily have an optical sorter, which really helped to remove some of those shriveled berries. And so for me, that's where most of the harshness was coming from. We usually sort somewhere between 1% and 3% for our Bordeaux reds. This year it was 5 to 10%. So it was pretty significant. We were all, it was all about the quality of the fruit and not the quantity. This was not a year to think about quantity if you were a quality producer, I think. So that happened. We lowered our fermentation temperatures. We kind of snuck up via limiting the amount of pump overs we were doing, snuck up to the pressing. We did a cold soak in the beginning, 3 days, but mostly that was just to get the sugars dialed in, more than actually for tannin management. It seemed to work out well, though. I'm happy with our colors. I'm happy with our flavors. And pressing, we pressed early. We did a lot more whole berry even on our cabs. Pressed out, just a touch early. And really we're paying attention at the pressing as well. So that was me.
Christina, you want to elaborate on maceration?
Sure. The first few grapes that come in the winery, I think you're always kind of like, okay, well, we'll just taste and see. But it became really evident to me early season after the first couple ferments that, extended maceration, this was not the year for. So I lengthened my cold soaking time, and we don't do any crushing. So everything comes in whole berry, gravity fed to tank. So it does take a little bit of time to get any type of maceration. So I put that all up front in the fermentation. Cold soak, I actually elevated my temperature initially, but then brought it down significantly at the end of fermentation. Trying to get as much oxygen as possible into the fermentation as well in the beginning, because the tannins did seem very tight, very short mouthfeel, so trying to really expand out that mouthfeel. And then at the end, it was kind of like, okay, I can't do anything else. It's kind of the tannins were exhausted. I don't know, they were tired. I would, from the Vivalese presentation about sugar loading, I would say that they were reactive, but for a very short amount of time, which was all very front-loaded. So typically I would use press fractions to really build out the palate. After tasting off on the first few presses, I ended up keeping everything separate in the end. Yeah.
I don't know if you want to comment or not on the winemaking.
I'll leave that to the people with the proper title.
Well, actually, I'd like to open the room to questions. I've been trying to lead some. Yes, please.
Did any of you utilize shade cloth? Was it detrimental or more effective?
So the question is, can you repeat the question?
Did any of us use shade cloth, and was it effective? I personally did not. We employ some shade canes, especially for our Petite Syrah, which seems to be really susceptible. So we actually pull cane, and it works wonders. It really does, but not shade cloth.
I didn't.
We do not use shade cloth, so we did, shift gears with our canopy management as the vintage progressed, and that first Father's Day heat spike kind of really got my attention. One of the things we did in our VSP canopies that really we found helpful was we did do some leafing on the morning sun side, but as we did that, we took the lower wire and pulled it all the way down, and that allowed the leaves above the fruit zone to spring out a little bit and provide more shade. So it's not shade cloth, but it's just using the conditions in the field to kind of get there.
Any other questions?
Everybody's hungry.
Yeah. Well, maybe I have one last one before to break. I wanted to hear your response regarding this idea that some varietals, particularly the later one in the case of late season heat spikes, are going to show a decoupling between phenolics and sugar maturity. I want to hear about you. Like, do you observe that, or are you in disagreement with those observations? How has been your management of sugar loading in order to assess phenolics maturity? Is it a proxy, not a proxy? I'd like to hear your thoughts on that.
Okay. For us, I think we definitely did see, particularly in our, I was describing earlier two different kind of scenarios with blocks and rootstock combinations. In the lighter soils and the more riparian-based rootstocks, we did see more of a kind of an extreme decoupling. And you can only sort of wait so long with sugar accumulation to a certain point, and those blocks did come in earlier. Some of our later ripening varietals are also on rupestris rootstocks, and those blocks tend to do quite better, not just physically, but in terms of anthocyanin accumulation over time. So variability within the vineyards.
Nice. Christina, would you like to comment on?
Yeah. I actually monitor sugar loading on the majority of my blocks. This year, that information, although it was coming to me, I wasn't looking at it as much as the volume loss. And I was thinking, as Rob Davis was talking about the desiccated clusters, I'm like, how many of those berries ended up in my samples that we were monitoring volume, because that could have also skewed a lot of the sugar loading results that I was looking at. Of course, there were clusters that were completely desiccated, but then there were clusters with some berries that were more shriveled than others. So I was wondering about that. But I had, I would say, during harvest, those sugar loading curves kind of became relevant just because I was so concerned about the volume loss, and I was looking more at that and just being out in the vineyard. Now that the harvest is over, I like to look at those sugar loading curves to more see how each block behaved differently, more of as a diagnostic tool. To see how each of the blocks reacted to the heat event.
Okay, so that you perceive clearly the effect of heat on those maturity. What about you, Jen?
Well, I think it was a mixed bag. I mean, for us, and we don't measure, but yeah, I think we saw it kind of a mixed bag. depending on the vineyard. So I have a question. Micro sprinklers, do you have any of those, Ned?
No, though when Rob mentioned those earlier, that it does sound like, that's an attractive idea. I mean, because, just to keep things cool.
Yes, so on micro sprinklers, I was part of a study. We try to understand what's the most efficient way to use micro sprinklers. Should you use them continuously? Is it better to have pulse? And if pulse is having the same effects, what should be the frequency of the pulse? What should be the duration of pulse? And some of the results have been published in 2017 in the Australian Journal. And at the end of the day, what surprised me is that a 20-second pulse every 10 minutes has the same effect than a continuous pulse. So we could actually shift a little bit the way we think about using water in vineyards. Instead of using water to re-wet the root system, at least on deeper root site situations, maybe we should look at mitigating high vapor pressure deficit by watering the atmosphere. And if we are talking about 20 seconds every 10 minutes, maybe it's a better way of using water to keep the integrity of the crop. And I think it's a shift in how to use water. It's maybe not so important to combat the lack of moisture in the root system late season, particularly because the plant needs less water, and maybe more efficient from a production standpoint to combat the negative effect of severe water deficit. So in the air. So I leave that question open, but it seems to be an interesting alley to explore, and instead of irrigating the roots, irrigating the leaves, so to speak, might be interesting.
And a question to kind of follow up on that. Do you think the benefit would be to lower the water, the irrigation, but also the temperature within the fruit zone, or the humidity?
Yeah, so it will be very counterintuitive, but the main benefit is you lower VPD, and by putting more moisture in the air, you lower vine water use. So it's counterintuitive because you think that you're going to boost water use, but in fact, VPD can increase fourfold. A high VPD for the same level of light can triple or quadruple the amount of water loss. So by putting more moisture in the air, you're lowering vine water consumption. So it's a bit counterintuitive, but through VPD, you make more water available around the fruit zone. So the temperature fluctuations are a little bit more buffered because there is more air moisture, but you are also lowering the amount of daily water consumption. So therefore, you're keeping more moisture into your plant's tissue. So that's through VPD, I think, so not only are you lowering maximum temperature, you're also affecting the water vapor environment. Does that? Yeah. All right, there is one last question, and we.
A gallon and a half of water per hour is the equivalent of a ton of refrigeration. So it takes almost no water to cool a canopy.
Right. Absolutely. And that's how 20 seconds of mist can have a 10 minutes effect. Yeah, absolutely. Well, Matt, and then that's the last. Yes, go ahead. Yes, so it's varietal dependent. I mean, that's a question. To give an in-depth question, we will need to elaborate beyond the scope of this discussion. But essentially, you have varietals like Merlot, Petit Verdot that are a little bit more sensitive, and you need to lower the vapor pressure deficit at which you start misting. But for Cabernet Sauvignon, Grenache varietals, or Shiraz also. Shiraz belongs to the first group of early VPD trigger. For Cabernet Sauvignon, Grenache, we trigger at higher vapor pressure deficit values. But that ties onto plant resilience to cavitation and fruit susceptibility to heat. So I'm happy to keep that conversation going, or maybe bring it on a different vintage report. But it's that's essentially what we are monitoring with SAPFlow. The SAPFlow tells us where to refine these threshold at which we should mist. Well, thank you very much, and I hope the conversation keeps going.